Iowa Public Television, your statewide public television network.
Major funding for this program is provided by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.
If it gets fouled up the first time, I don't believe in our generation, or maybe even a couple afterwards, that we have another chance.
For 40 years, we have built atomic weapons and generated nuclear power. It's left us with a legacy. 10,000 tons of the most radioactive substance on Earth, high-level nuclear waste. Temporary storage facilities are wearing out. Sooner or later, we must find a permanent way to dispose of it.
The waste is already here. It's already sitting on the surface. It's already presenting a risk to us and to all future generations.
The administration today has selected 3 candidate sites for the first geological repository.
Under a new federal law, nuclear waste will now be permanently buried in either Texas, Nevada, or Washington. As the final decision approaches, this has become one of the most complex and frightening decisions of the decade.
Any repository that's built is going to place the local population at risk for increased cancers and genetic mutations.
If we are not successful in this program, that is, in disposing permanently of the waste that we have generated, it is my view that we will very seriously raise questions as to whether nuclear power will be a viable energy source in the future.
For the Theodore Roosevelt is being taken to Hanford by barge up the Columbia.
We've got 99% of the volume of the waste, of all high-level and transuranic waste in the country, yet we only have 10% of the radioactivity.
Cancer rates for Hanford workers are substantively better than a national norm and substantively better than any segment of this state, of Washington.
The Department of Energy calls it an open house. In reality, it's public relations. The DOE hopes to convince people here in Seattle that nuclear waste can be safely disposed of. The Hanford Reservation in eastern Washington may be the site for the permanent burial of nuclear waste.
We don't deal with it right now. Down the road, future generations, none of us will be around.
It's still the whole thing. There's no justification for irresponsibility on the part of the Department of Energy.
No.
The Department of Energy has an office here, too, in Deaf Smith County, Texas. Also a possible site for the burial of nuclear waste. But this office is empty. Local farmers have already made up their minds.
They've got a job to do, and they're not particularly worried about the environment. They're not worried about what they're going to do to the country.
I don't think any place on the face of this earth deserves nuclear waste. If it's the desert or the bottom of the ocean.
It's also happening in Nevada. This is a Department of Energy bus tour to the third possible burial site. Here, too, people are skeptical.
Just the idea of having nuclear waste deposited in our state has a fearful connotation as far as I'm concerned.
Nuclear waste is something nobody wants. But today's problem is the legacy of a time when things were different. It was more than 40 years ago, and the world was at war. Europe was under siege. The Germans had conquered Poland, Czechoslovakia, Belgium, France. By 1941, the Japanese had attacked Pearl Harbor. We were surrounded by our enemies. In response, a team of scientists was secretly gathered at Los Alamos, New Mexico. Their mission? To construct the ultimate weapon. left 200,000 dead or injured. Within 2 weeks, the Japanese had surrendered. But there was no end to the arms race. The A-bomb gave way to the H-bomb. By 1954, we had a nuclear navy. A nuclear-powered ship was fueled by a small-scale nuclear reactor. An expanded reactor could generate commercial electricity. The atom could be used to benefit rather than destroy. The possibilities seemed limitless. Experts predicted electricity would become so cheap it would no longer need to be metered. But both weapons production and the expansion of nuclear power were leaving us with dangerous but unavoidable byproducts. The most radioactive of these would be known as high-level nuclear waste. This high-level waste included hundreds of used fuel rods from the new power plants. The original plan was for these to be chemically treated and reused, but the process proved too expensive, and recycled fuel could be more easily turned into bombs. Calling it a security risk, President Carter ordered the process halted in 1977. In the 1950s, we dumped waste into the ocean. The barrels leaked, and there was contamination at several offshore locations. We thought about launching the waste into space. It was never attempted for fear of a launch accident. In the 1960s, we tried to bury the waste. An underground repository was under construction in Kansas when old mining tunnels were discovered nearby. Experts feared the waste might escape through these tunnels and contaminate the area. The project had to be abandoned. For 40 years, we have produced nuclear waste with no permanent way to dispose of it. Each new attempt has failed. Our stockpile of high-level waste continues to grow, and as it does, the need to dispose of it has become a national crisis. High-level waste comes in many forms. This is spent fuel just being removed from a nuclear reactor. While inside the reactor, a fuel rod becomes the most radioactive substance on Earth. After 3 years, it can no longer generate electricity and must be stored in a heavily shielded cooling pool. Without this shielding, it would deliver a lethal dose of radiation in seconds, and it remains radioactive for 100,000 years. This is a nuclear reactor near Portland, Oregon. The spent fuel in these pools has been here for decades, waiting for a permanent method of disposal.
The material needs to be isolated from people, and that's the reason that it's handled the way it is, handled underwater and stored in a facility that's specifically designed for that purpose. But the storage that we've provided here certainly isn't the type of storage that you'd want to provide for the time period required for the ultimate disposal.
The manufacture of weapons also generates waste. This is the Hanford Reservation in eastern Washington, a center of nuclear weapons production. The high-level waste here is a liquid. It was once stored behind this fence. Pipes and gauges mark the location of underground tanks, each of which once held up to 1 million gallons. But in the early 1970s, these tanks began to leak, and before the Department of Energy could take action, 500,000 gallons had leaked into the ground. The remaining waste was transferred to a new set of tanks, but eventually these too will wear out.
The problem of nuclear waste disposal has to be solved. Certainly we know that here at Hanford more than anywhere else because we have a large accumulation of it from our defense programs. But also at reactors, at locations all around this country, we have spent fuel stored. And we need to say what we're going to permanently do with that.
Not having that repository does raise some questions about whether or not you should continue to generate nuclear waste. And Some states, for example, have laws saying you can't have a nuclear power plant, a new nuclear power plant, until there's a solution to the waste problem.
If we are not successful in this program, that is, in disposing permanently of the waste that we have generated, it is my view that we will very seriously raise questions as to whether nuclear power will be a viable energy source in the future.
Increasing pressure from both industry and environmentalists led Congress to take action. The result was the Nuclear Waste Policy Act. It was signed into law on January 7, 1983.
The step we're taking today should demonstrate to the public that the challenge of coping with nuclear waste can and will be met with resolve and the good sense to work together, as was demonstrated by the Congress on this issue. We can and will prevail over the sometimes complex and perplexing problems associated with energy.
The plan was to build 2 permanent underground storage vaults, the first in the west, the second in the east. Work would be supervised by the Department of Energy.
Construction of a repository and the operation of a repository does not involve any new technology. It's ordinary mining techniques that are used in various places in this country and around the world.
Ben Rushi is Director of Civilian Radioactive Waste Management. His job, to implement the Nuclear Waste Policy Act.
Very important at this stage of the game is to find a site that has a desirable set of properties. There's not much question in my mind, but that we can and will amongst the sites that we are considering now.
From an original list of 9 possible sites, the Department of Energy would pick 3 for further study. After both public and private debate, the decision was made official on May 28, 1986.
The Department of Energy will now undertake detailed study and characterization of 3 sites, one in Yucca Mountain, Nevada, the second in Deaf Smith, Texas, and the third in Hanford, Washington.
To the surprise of the nation, the department had also decided that work on the second repository would be halted.
Based on the progress that we are making towards selecting a first repository site, I've reassessed the timing of the department's activities towards identification of candidates for a second repository. And I have decided to postpone indefinitely plans for any site-specific work related to a second repository.
Western states would immediately challenge this decision in court. The waste was largely located in the east, but the west was being asked to bury it. And how had the top 3 sites been selected? In Texas, Nevada, and Washington, this would be the most frightening decision of the decade. The Hanford Reservation in eastern Washington, 570 square miles of desert, remote, dry, and unpopulated. In many ways, an obvious choice for the burial of nuclear waste. Hanford is already owned by the Department of Energy. The workforce is equipped to handle radioactive material, and the reservation is guarded by a well-trained security force. But the biggest factor may have been public opinion. The nearby town of Richland is often referred to as the atomic capital of America. Richland is a residential community for Hanford employees. The town is financially dependent on the government. A repository would create 1,100 new jobs, and confidence in the DOE is high.
People who live and work in this area are in the nuclear business. But by the same token, there are also people that have their families within this community, send their kids to school in this community. They breathe the same air, they drink the same water, and to think that these people who are knowledgeable are going to subject their families and their friends to anything that's dangerous or hazardous is totally absurd.
But elsewhere in Washington, the repository is viewed with alarm. Geologist Bill Brewer works for the state.
For many years it was assumed, I suppose, that there really wasn't a problem. And now that more people who aren't necessarily dedicated to making a repository happen at Hanford, as we get out into the field, we begin to see things that cause us concern.
See, the problem at Hanford is a groundwater problem. The only way that the radionuclides can get out of a repository 3,000 feet deep is by contaminating the groundwater. This is the medium that can bring contaminated material to the surface, to the river.
Below the ground at Hanford, there are layers of volcanic rock called basalt. The basalt contains microscopic fractures which could provide a pathway for contaminated water. The Columbia River passes within 4.5 miles of the repository site. The state's biggest worry is what might happen if the Columbia were contaminated.
If we assume that the groundwater resources in the Pacific Northwest and the Columbia River become contaminated to such a point that their usability is impaired, the impact on the Pacific Northwest would be immeasurable. The recreational opportunities, the Columbia River as a transportation corridor. Eastern Oregon raises a great deal of wheat. If that wheat becomes unsaleable because the public perception is that it has become contaminated, the impact on the Pacific Northwest would be immeasurable. The Japanese, for example, decide the Columbia River is no longer a usable resource. The Port of Portland may not any longer get the contract to receive the Japanese automobiles that are shipped in here by the thousands every month. All of those things, I don't even know how to give you a number for that except to say that the possible impact of that could be devastating on the Pacific Northwest if that were to happen.
The question now is, are the basalt horizons around the repository capable of keeping the contaminants out of formations like this? If groundwater gets into a horizon like that, it's going to move, and it's going to move fast. If the radionuclides are in the groundwater, they're eventually going to come to the surface. They're going to go to the Columbia River over geologic time, thousands of years.
If the aquifers that are going to be developed for irrigation, if those become contaminated, then you have a pathway to food and to people. You built the repository, centuries have gone by, you suddenly find that you can't use the land.
The Department of Energy admits that geologically Hanford is the worst of the sites studied. Even so, they included it in the top 3.
The most vulnerable point about the site is the groundwater circulation. But at this point, the guidelines that we in NRC have, we meet without any problems, and therefore we feel that we should continue and to collect information on the site.
Come on, Dave, do something.
6 hard, next 6,
That's pretty good.
Las Vegas is a place where people come to gamble and be entertained. Tourism is virtually the only industry. Visitors come to play out their luck and forget about back home. But now there is a new gamble that no one had counted on. 75 miles north of the city, on a remote desert, there is a place called Yucca Mountain. This is another of the possible sites for the burial of nuclear waste. Yucca Mountain has an elevation of 2,000 feet. The repository would be at 1,200 feet, 500 feet above the water table. The rock around the repository would remain dry, so groundwater contamination is less likely. There are no major rivers in the area, and the land is federally owned and guarded. But Yucca Mountain does have a serious drawback, the possibility of earthquakes.
We know, for example, that some of the faults that we've been examining recently appear to be as young as 4,000 to 6,000 years old. The Department of Energy's own siting guidelines requires that a site be generally disqualified if that activity is younger than 10,000 years old. So if we're talking about long-term geologic stability as the primary criteria we're looking for good sites to isolate and contain these materials, I'm not certain that the southern Nevada area is an area that needs to be looked at a whole heck of a lot longer.
After the repositories close, there's very little potential impact that an earthquake would have on releasing the radioactive material. The waste will be in a solid form, contained in a container inside of solid rock. If movement did occur on the fault, producing a vibrating motion, it would basically just shake the can of waste inside of the hole in which it's placed.
Okay, press the button. Try again,
But the state's biggest fear is not earthquakes. On its way to Yucca Mountain, the waste would pass within a few hundred yards of downtown Las Vegas.
We're talking about 140,000 shipments arriving separately, individually, around the clock for a period of 20 to 30 years, streaming in from all points of the compass to Nevada, many of which would have to go through the metropolitan area of our largest city in Las Vegas, with a metropolitan population exceeding 500,000 people.
I just don't like that kind of stuff where you're going to be staying or whatever. Too dangerous. I wouldn't come here if it was that.
You'd be worried.
I'd be worried over it.
Very much so.
Yes, it would worry me.
Why?
Nuclear waste worries me, period.
Traffic around here and stuff, a truck wreck or something like that and dumping it. I don't think they could evacuate all these people.
The millions and billions of dollars that changes hands every day in the city, I think it could have an effect on the tourist industry. I really do.
Not only are there public health considerations, which are first and foremost of concern to us all, but the implications to Nevada as a resort and tourist destination are absolutely mind-boggling.
I think we'll have to use the black grease in there. I plan on being on this farm for the rest of my life, producing a high-quality, economical food product for the people of the world. That's really all I ask. Let me make a living and I'll feed you.
This is Deaf Smith County, Texas. Dale Kluskin's farm is 9 miles from the third possible site for the burial of nuclear waste.
We go out and we tenderly care for this land. It's so delicate. It's just unimaginable for me to even think that the government would come into such a productive area and put it all at risk.
Deaf Smith County is the most productive agricultural county in Texas, and the third most productive in the nation. Livestock and farm production combined generate $500 million a year. But in addition to farming, the county supports other unique business operations. Wayne Richardson owns a commercial seed company. It would be adjacent to the proposed repository.
Any radiation mutates seeds, plants of all types. Any mutating effect would, of course, damage our reputation, damage our total business, because we could no longer deliver to the consumer or the farmer the genetically pure seeds that we have in the past 30 years.
Arrowhead Mills is an organic foods business, one of the largest.
nuclear waste is not compatible with any kind of food, and certainly not with the organically grown specialty that we try to produce and market. The nuclear power industry's credibility in the United States is such that to come to the #1 agricultural county and say we're going to use you for a garbage dump is really beyond the pale of reason.
The farm economy of northern Texas depends on water. Water pumped from an underground reservoir called the Ogallala Aquifer. This aquifer is the largest in the country, stretching from the Texas Panhandle to southern South Dakota. It supplies water to the 8 most productive agricultural states in the nation. The Department of Energy would build the repository in salt beds 2,500 feet below ground. Salt is dry and geologically stable, but to reach the salt, the repository shaft would pass directly through the aquifer.
Literally every mining engineer we've talked to so far says that shafts like this always leak.
Geologist Steve Frischman works for the state of Texas.
In order to contain the aquifer, they're proposing to use a freeze ring technology, where they in fact make a block of ice in the aquifer around this area and then mine down through the ice. Just the disturbance of that, of freezing and thawing, has created problems other places in the world the few times that they've tried to do this. And we're not entirely convinced that this being probably the thickest water body that anybody's ever tried to go through with that technology, we don't think that, it's really worth the experiment at this point.
The project basically involves constructing a mine, constructing shafts through the aquifer and sealing those off to prevent water from flowing up or down that shaft. That's a technology that is well established and has been practiced for 100 years. So part of our efforts have to be to educate people to the mining technology itself.
One of the things that we have known for quite some time is that if you put a heat source in salt that has water contained within the crystals, the water migrates to the heat source. The waste is a heat source. We're going to end up with these canisters essentially sitting in a puddle of brine, which is most corrosive of the canisters themselves.
But if in fact the brine corrodes the package and comes in contact with the waste, we think, based on what we know now, there's nowhere for it to go. It simply sits down there a half a mile in the rock.
There's just too much at stake, too much risk here for not only the people living here, but the whole state of Texas, Panhandle area, the many states. There's too much involved here with this aquifer and the food supplies, the seed supplies that go into the food chain related here. There's just too much risk.
The Department of Energy will spend $3 billion and another 5 years studying the 3 sites before the final decision is made.
All that geologists and hydrologists and others know now is very limited. We're going to go into the rock where we can literally observe it with our own eyes, not with instruments, where we can measure properties related to strength, related to hydrology and weather, if there is water, whether it's moving, and if so, how fast, in which ways. And my current judgment is we'll find them all suitable, and the question will be, from amongst those 3, which one serves the purpose best.
We're promoting a system and a schedule, a site selection process that is optimized to getting the job done by a certain date, whether or not that's safe.
David Barrick is an environmental lobbyist in Washington, D.C.
People shouldn't think that this material is going to be put in the repository and it's all going to stay there and it's not going to get out. It will get out. The question is how quickly and how many people will be exposed to it.
Waste would arrive at the repository packaged in steel canisters. The canisters would be lowered into cement-lined holes along more than 100 miles of underground tunnel. Once in place, each canister would be surrounded with crushed rock and cement. When full, the repository would contain 70,000 tons, enough to cover a football field 20 feet high, and the most radioactive mass on the planet. The government predicts that the structure will last 300 to 1,000 years, after which leaks will begin to reach the surrounding rock. The rock would need to contain these leaks, according to the Environmental Protection Agency, for a minimum of 10,000 years. But the 10,000-year standard is highly controversial. Many doubt it's long enough.
We have
plutonium and uranium, thorium, that have half-lives of 20,000, 40,000, 100,000 years. Over a period of tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of years, due to earthquakes, due to erosion, due to changes in the meteorological conditions, what you bury 1,000 feet below the surface of the earth may now be up near the surface or at the groundwater level. And so that's a situation where future civilization may be subjected to very large exposures.
These canyons in central Washington were carved by flooding that followed the last ice age 13,000 years ago. Erosion of this magnitude could unearth a repository. This is just 100 miles from the Hanford site. Geologists expect the ice to return 13,000 years into the future, but long-term climatic changes are difficult to predict. So the EPA settled for a 10,000-year standard.
The waste itself is hazardous for a very long period of time. It's just that in terms of being able to come before a licensing commission and prove your case, we felt that the tools were not sophisticated enough to say 100,000 years from now, projecting various climatic changes, floodplains changing, various kinds of things, ice caps melting, etc., that you would be able to make that kind of case 100,000 years into the future.
The Department of Energy says 10,000 years. In fact, the half-life of plutonium is 24,400 years, and it'll be 5 times that before it's 95% stabilized.
But I personally think it's better to have the final disposal operation in place, and you just have to proceed. Our standard, I think, is as best one can do with today's technology, and moreover, waiting another 10, 20, or 30 years is not going to change that.
Writing was invented about 6,000 or 8,000 years ago, so that's the extent of written history. And we have gone through many dynasties and lots of mischief since that time. The probability of being able to put the stuff underground and not have a major catastrophe, in my opinion, is 0.
Some fear the catastrophe will arrive in another form. This is the border between Oregon and Washington.
State Patrol, scale 54, Bray.
A truck carrying spent fuel to the Hanford Reservation is about to enter the state of Washington. Its cargo will be extremely dangerous.
We go anywhere from 2 to 5 millirankins, and before we'll even get concerned about it at all. And if we get up around 5, that's when we contact Hanford and let them know. Since I've been here, I know we've never had anything like that.
Okay, headlights, high beams, horn. Okay, hit it. Right, left turn again.
I'd say 25 to 30% of the trucks that we check, we'll put them out of service for one defect or another. But when I say out of service, they might be out of service just to adjust one brake, and then they're on their way. As far as anything really severe where we've had to stop the truck right here and have somebody come out and fix it, we've never had that. Fastest flying colors, 100%.
Well, I'm glad to hear that.
Drivers of these trucks undergo a 1-week training program.
It's radioactive, but that's it. That's all I'll tell you. Or what they call constant surveillance loads. In other words, one person has to stay with the load at all times.
You can't go off your route in order to get to a place to eat. You have to stay on your routes.
You kind of keep a kind of a low profile, if you put it to you that way, a low profile.
Once the repository is built, the backlog of spent fuel will require a shipment every 90 minutes, around the clock, every day, for 20 years. 140,000 shipments in all. If the repository were located in Nevada, for example, Trains are projected to follow these routes. Trucks would use these highways. At one time or another, waste would pass through 45 out of 50 states and through thousands of cities and towns. A major truck route crosses the state of Colorado, passing directly through Denver.
We're going to have a large number of shipments coming through the city, and we know that there will be accidents. We're certainly not prepared to deal with radioactive spills of the kind of magnitude and variety that we're likely to see.
Denver has had experience with dangerous accidents. The worst one was in August of 1984. A truck hauling Navy torpedoes approached the city on a main interstate. The driver was new to Denver and inexperienced. At about 5 a.m., the truck reached an interchange known as the Mousetrap. Deputy Fire Chief Eldon Buller.
We felt like she was going pretty fast. She apparently seen the sign at this time and made this curve, which this isn't a very tight curve. But as you come around to the left, right here is where she started to have her problems with it. The rig was going too fast. And right here, there were some skid marks that put her off against this right over here, and she hit that retaining wall right there.
The truck had turned over, and officials feared the torpedoes might detonate. Chief Buller attempted to call the Navy's emergency phone number. No one answered. He finally reached a bomb demolition squad at a nearby Army base, but the Army took 3 hours to arrive, and they lacked any knowledge of torpedoes. Navy torpedo experts arrived 7 hours after the accident. Without a fire, the torpedoes would not have detonated, but 100 people had already been evacuated, and thousands of commuters were stranded on the interstate.
We found it in Denver with a rather sophisticated hazardous material response team, very difficult to respond to torpedoes on our highways. We would have great difficulty as a major city in this part of the country to deal with nuclear materials that are spilled on our highways. But for small towns and rural areas in this state, they would be totally at the mercy of some federal response team that may be coming from somewhere else in this country, and which may take hours, days, to get to the site and actually deal with a spill.
In our mountain communities where Interstate 70 goes over the mountains, it's very likely that they could have an accident there due to bad weather. What if it's a runaway truck with spent nuclear fuel on it? Who handles that? Who responds to that? How fast do they do it? What do we do with all the people that are contaminated? Where do they go when they're in a pocket in a valley in the mountains? I think it's going to be one of the major events in the United States when one of these trucks spills their load somewhere in the United States.
The Department of Energy is less worried about transportation accidents than anything else. This film shows why. It depicts a series of tests designed to prove that nuclear waste shipping containers could withstand the severest accidents.
A truck carrying a 22-ton spent fuel cask impacted a 690-ton concrete block at 60 miles per hour. The cask sustained so little damage, it was cleaned up and impacted a second time, but at 84 miles per hour. The cask also survived this more violent crash with only minor damage. In the third test, a diesel locomotive crashed into a truck at 81 miles per hour. The stalled truck carried a 25-ton shipping cask. The ability of the cask to contain and shield its radioactive contents was not compromised. The final impact test had a 74-ton shipping cask carried by a cask rail car crash into the concrete block at 81 miles per hour. This same cask and rail car were then positioned over a pool of jet fuel and subjected to an engulfing fire, much more severe than the fire that might occur in a train wreck. After 90 minutes, surface temperatures exceeded 1400 degrees Fahrenheit, but inside the cask, temperatures were below 300 degrees, not enough to melt the spent fuel rods. And there was no evidence to indicate that even the combination of the crash and fire would have released excessive amounts of radioactivity into the environment.
Bob Jefferson supervised the crash tests.
Well, first of all, there will be accidents. Anytime you're moving things, there are accidents. The concept early on was that the cask should provide all of the protection that's needed to assure the safety of the public. And that means you don't depend upon specially trained handling people on the docks. You don't depend upon special drivers or special vehicles or special highways or anything special. Everything is wrapped up in the cask.
In the first test, a truck carried...
But these tests have been the subject of criticism. Nuclear physicist Dr. Marvin Resnikoff.
The truck does go into the wall at 60 miles an hour, as the film says, but the cask itself does not go into the wall at 60 miles an hour. The cab right there absorbs most of the collision, and by the time the cask hits the wall, that's going less than 30 miles an hour when it hits the wall. They did a second test, which they mentioned is at a much faster speed. They say it survived with only minor damage. What they mean is approximately 100 milliliters of water was released from the container. If you were to have an accident and have a large fire, then the container would be much more pressurized and much more than 100 milliliters would have gotten out. This fire did burn for 90 minutes, but then they don't have the film roll for the next 10 minutes. It continued to let out steam.
The spent fuel inside one cask would contain 10 times the radioactive cesium in the Hiroshima bomb. Cesium can be vaporized by heat.
It's possible for the fuel assemblies to mix with the water vapor and actually exit the container as steam. There was a large amount of radioactivity inside of each container. And you don't need a large amount to be released in order to have a major accident. There have been about 6,000 shipments in this country. There have been no releases of radioactive material whatsoever. We routinely ship thousands of hazardous materials through urban areas all the time. We have a long history of accidents involving the public with those materials, killing tens, sometimes hundreds of people. In all the shipment of radioactives, we've never injured or killed anyone.
Even before the top 3 sites were selected, citizen groups in Deaf Smith County had organized a barbecue dinner and rally in opposition to the repository. Local folks turned out, and so did the politicians. The guest of honor was Attorney General Jim Maddox. Maddox plans to run for governor, and this is certain to win votes.
I think before they put that nuclear waste in, we ought to get right down to business and roll them out. I'm hopeful that they'll understand that we pretty much are opposed to this thing.
Maddox has been an aggressive legal advocate for Texas. Under his direction, the state has taken the Department of Energy to court.
We intend with the local constituents and with our lawsuits to persuade the federal government that it'd be better to locate the site someplace else. We have looked at all 9 of the potential sites, and we believe that none of them are satisfactory. We believe that they are moving on the line of expediency and not on the line of on the best geological formation.
We'd like for you to sign the new petition. We'd like to get new names and maybe old names that are already on a petition.
We'd say if this is the best place in this entire United States to put it, so be it, put it out there. But I can tell you this by just looking at these other sites and everything, Texas is not even the best out of the 9, all of which are flawed in some way or another. It makes me a little cautious. It makes me want to take a little more time. And we're going to continue in our struggle. And I thank you for taking the time out of your busy lives to exhibit the courage that's going to take to fight this battle. Thank you very much for allowing me to be here.
The Nuclear Waste Policy Act specifies that the governor of the state chosen for the repository will have a right to veto that decision. The veto can only be overruled by a majority vote of both the House and the Senate. A state with a powerful congressional delegation would have a better chance of blocking that override.
Good morning, Senator Graham's office.
Republican Senator Phil Gramm is a member of the Texas delegation, among the most powerful in the nation.
By 1991, we're going to have the second largest delegation in the House in the country. We have a two-track process. One is a technical process, the other is a political process. They both work independently until the end. My guess is that we're stuck with that process, but I certainly can assure you and the people of Texas that so long as they're opposed to it, I'm going to make the process work for them, and we're going to prevent it from coming to the Panhandle.
Deaf Smith, Texas is not going to get it because the political cloud of Texas is strong, and we all know that it's just not going to happen. Hanford has its own problems with water problems or whatever. It's not going to get it. So if they go forward with those three, who's left? You know, Nevada with its 4-member congressional delegation. So we've got to do all we can to fight it now.
The Las Vegas Sun is the second largest paper in Nevada. Editorially opposed to the repository, the paper decided to see if its readers would take action.
The people are against this issue, and we're tired of just saying it. So what we did is we came up with a coupon, and I'll show you. This is a coupon we ran in our paper for 2 or 3 weeks. And it says, I vehemently protest making Clark County a nuke waste dumping ground for New Jersey or any other state. Please register my protest. You have to clip it out of the paper, put it in an envelope, address the envelope, put a stamp on it, and mail it. You know, if you get 1 or 2% of the people to respond on an issue like that, you say that's a major success. They had over 30,000 of these coupons sent into Thalia Dondero at the county commissioners. 30,000 people. I'd say a number of the people in the county commission and the other governing bodies here were against it in principle anyway. They were all unified 100% in their opposition after they started hearing from the people.
Wrenches, screwdrivers, torque wrenches, various types of tools that you use ordinarily in a shop, we've adapted to work with the master-slave manipulators.
The Department of Energy has launched a public relations campaign of its own. This group is on a tour of the Nevada test site.
And they're looking at engineering the best ways to transport the nuclear waste, to package it safely, and they're looking at various ways of storing it and permanently burying it underground. The objective of this experiment was to demonstrate that we had the know-how to safely transport the nuclear waste. So then after the spent fuel was lowered into the floor and a 5,000-pound concrete plug placed over it, the shielding was such that the natural background radiation coming off the granite in the walls was more than anybody could detect coming out of the floors. There's nothing in this right at this time. The experiment was from 80 to 83, but it is an engineering idea that worked.
But the last stop on the tour was a place that invoked too many memories.
This is Frenchman Flat. The largest test here was codenamed Priscilla. That was 37 kiloton in 57, and a lot of people in Las Vegas remember that test. It was a bright orange-pink mushroom cloud that could be seen clear from here to Las Vegas.
After the shot was detonated, anywhere from 30 minutes to an hour, we'd go in and recover instruments. And the ground was smoldering hot. We had coveralls, cotton, which doesn't keep the dust out. Okay? Rubber booties over our shoes. Our underclothes, we just put coveralls on. We brought that stuff back home.
Ben Levy was one of several thousand civilians who set up and dismantled the tests at Frenchman Flats. Levy learned that many of his former co-workers were contracting cancer.
James Cushman, cancer of the prostate. Teddy Duke, he's deceased. Paul Friedling died of cancer. Bert Miller, cancer of the pancreas. Jay Mullen, cancer of the lungs. Joe Nay's myeloma leukemia.
In Levy's union local, 382 men had worked on the tests. More than 50 had cancer, including twice the normal rate of leukemia, a cancer caused by radiation.
William Porter, cancer of the lungs. Jane Bradley, acute leukemia. Janet Perani, throat, cancer of the throat. Hy Gibson died cancer of the lung. Little, cancer of the liver. Bobby Somerville, cancer of the colon.
Studies on the health effects of radiation are controversial, but in a number of cases, even low levels of radiation have caused cancer.
It's a brain tumor, a malignant brain tumor.
Don Gable died of cancer in 1980, a short time after this interview. He is one of the increasing number whose death resulted from work at a nuclear weapons facility.
If you look back over many decades, we've consistently, at each time, underestimated the potential harm.
Jim Steele and Don Barlett are Pulitzer Prize-winning reporters. They co-authored a book on nuclear waste.
Time and time again, the public authorities have said this will not happen or this will happen, and they've turned out to be wrong.
Perhaps the best illustration of this is the Marshall Islands. The natives were removed during the 50s and 60s because of atomic bomb tests. The federal government cleaned up the island and said it's perfectly safe, the natives can go home. They went back in 74. By 78, the internal radiation levels in some of the natives had risen 300%.
The tanks at Hanford, they said those tanks will last many, many years and they will not leak. And in fact, they were tremendously wrong. And we don't fault a number of people for not having the answers to that. That's not, the point here. The point is that they presume to say at each stage what is and is not acceptable, what will or will not work, when in fact they can't really say that based on the information they have.
They've ruined hundreds of acres of the United States, fenced it off with fences and signs that said don't enter here for thousands of years. And they say, well, we've refined our methods, don't worry, it'll be safe. And I don't go for it.
After having been involved and seen what we've seen within the workings of the Department of Energy, we find it very questionable whether or not they could build a safe repository no matter where they built it in the United States.
There, at this point, is not a great deal that gives people a lot of confidence that we, in fact, are handling radioactivity in ways that are safe for everyone. There is no evidence that they're foolish for being worried. In fact, there's a lot of evidence in the other direction as we learn more about the effects of radiation that we have already spread around the country.
Even assuming that the scientific community is giving us its best judgment at this time, that what will another 30 years tell us? You know, folks, we were wrong. We thought we were right. People that are looking to the future in our state are saying, we don't want to take that kind of a gamble.
We think the process ought to be stopped in its tracks right now, that we ought to get away from this insidious desire or need to follow a timeline when we've got such an important national problem to solve.
The 3 states had made up their minds, and they have taken their case to Congress.
So what we'd like to suggest is the following. Bring the process to an immediate halt for the moment. Secondly, restructure the site selection process. Establish a significant decision-making role for independent technical groups such as the U.S.
It's just not practical, nor is it technically necessary, in my opinion, that we do anything other than we're doing. We are spending a lot of money, because a lot of money needs to be spent, to find very confident information. When we get it, we will know with great confidence which of those sites ought to be the site used.
The fact that we don't know what to do with the nuclear waste does call into question whether or not we should continue to produce it. They are also promising the utility industry that there will be a repository by a certain date. That's all going to combine into enormous political pressures to just push on, even if there are questions about how good the final site is.
We are overseen by at least 6 congressional committees. We're audited by everybody and his brother, and every state has or will have its own auditing exercise and oversight view. So I'd say that in this case, to a degree much smaller than in any other case, is that a factor.
The waste is being stored and has been stored for several decades without harm. But I personally think it's better to have the final disposal operation in place, and you just have to proceed.
Well, think also about making generations of people to be living on this earth year 10,000, year 100,000, that will have genetic deformities, that will have a high incidence of cancer and other diseases, just because of our mistakes, just because we were in too much of a hurry to get rid of this bear we have by the tail.
In October 1986, congressional investigators discovered the Department of Energy had censored its own staff recommendation that the Hanford site be dropped from the top 3. Congress voted to cut $212 million from the DOE budget, and drilling at all 3 sites was prohibited until 1988. The department insisted, however, that despite these setbacks, repository research would continue.
Stay tuned to Iowa Public Television and meet 2 eagles who were given a second chance at life in the wild. Watch The Eagle Returns in just a moment. From adventure to comedy, be watching tomorrow for TV worth celebrating. At 7, join the first Americans to climb the fierce north wall of Mount Everest. Then have an hour of fun. At 8, enjoy the satire of Mark Russell, and then laugh as Mark Pearson trims the tree, stuffs the bird, and goes toy shopping. At 9, take a behind-the-scenes look at the private and public lives of retiring Speaker of the House, Thomas Tip O'Neill. That's all tomorrow evening on Iowa Public Television.
Major funding for this program was provided by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.
For a transcript of this program, send $4 to PTV Publications, P.O. Box 701, Kent, Ohio 44240.
Before Stonewall tells the exciting and untold story of gay and lesbian life from the roaring 20s to the rebellious 60s.
And that next night, I was in a room with 12 other lesbians for the first time in my life, and oh, what a thrill that was.
Homosexuality has always been a dirty word.
Watch this special tonight at 9:30.
Hello, I'm Louis Rukeyser, inviting you to join me for a very special one-hour program on the new tax law and you. We'll explain how this historic change really will affect you in 1987 and beyond. And even more important, what steps you can take now to lower your taxes and raise your wealth. I'll have a blue ribbon panel of experts designed to give you many happier returns.
See this special program Thursday at 7.
1951's most valuable player in the Big Ten was a University of Iowa fullback. Now Des Moines clothier Bill Reichart says he was playing a high-stakes game.
I've really never said this publicly, but since you asked me the question, I was the highest illegally paid football player in the history of Iowa to my day.
This is Pat Bodie. Join us for Touchstone Thursday night at 8:30.
Explore nature's power from a forbidden realm where lions of the African night silently stalk their prey to fiery fields and boiling waters in the shadow of Vesuvius. 2 great National Geographic specials. Watch for them.
Coming to Iowa Public Television next year.
You're watching Iowa Public Television.